It says right here, no skipping through town on Sunday whilst eating an ear of corn. These reenactors take their blue laws seriously. Dear Tim and Moby, why did England make 13 American colonies? Wouldn't it have been simpler just to make one big one? From Marlena. Huh, good question.
Hey, what's happening? Sorry, I didn't know if you guys had already left.
From the beginning. But the 13 colonies weren't set up based on some well-organized master plan. The only real plan England had was to get rich and powerful. A popular British play at the time described Virginia as a paradise coated in gold. Streets were filled with it, toilets were made of it, prisoners were even bound with golden rope. Of course, the play's authors had never been to Virginia, but Europe was obsessed with stories about riches in the so-called New World. It started with Christopher Columbus bringing back news of the Americas in 1493. Then the race was on to snatch up all that land. All of Europe's powers wanted in. Spain had a head start since Columbus was working for them. In the 1500s, they grew fabulously wealthy on gold and other resources from South America and Mesoamerica. Portugal was close behind, making a fortune growing sugarcane in Brazil. Setting up colonies to get rich was part of a system called mercantilism. Governments tried to accumulate as much wealth as possible through trade. For Spain, that meant importing lots of gold and silver mined in the colonies. For other countries, it meant shipping raw materials from the colonies to the motherland, turning them into finished goods, and then exporting those goods for sale to the colonies and other nations. By the early 1600s, England was ready to get in on all this colonizing action. South and Central America had already been claimed by then. So, King James I fixed his eye on America's East Coast. Well, no, people already lived there and had for thousands of years. The native peoples of North America had their own civilizations and cultures. But that didn't stop England from laying claim to the land. In 1606, the king issued a charter to set up a colony in Virginia. It granted a private company the right to settle the land. The company then rented it out to English citizens to go live there. In return for the charter, the colony would send home a portion of its valuable resources, like gold. But as it turned out, there was no gold in Virginia. Lucky for them, the new colony soon hit on another big moneymaker: tobacco. Yeah, King James thought smoking was a nasty habit too. But he didn't seem to mind all the money it made him. In the coming decades, a bunch more charters were issued for new colonies. Southern colonies like Virginia were based around farming. Besides tobacco, they planted rice, indigo, and cotton, cash crops grown for profit. And since they didn't pay the workforce, those profits were huge. The whole system was built on slavery. People from West Africa were kidnapped, sold into slavery, and shipped to the colonies. Their journey to America was one leg in the triangular trade. In the next leg, crops and other raw materials from the colonies were shipped back to England. There, they were manufactured into goods and shipped to Africa to be traded for more slaves. But it wasn't only the southern colonies involved in the slave trade. Colonies to the north began exporting rum to Africa, trading it for enslaved people. They were brought to the Caribbean islands and forced to work on sugar plantations. Then the sugar was sent back to the colonies to be made into more rum. Cutting England out of the deal like that was sort of against the rules of mercantilism. But the Crown was making too much money on other colonial businesses to care. The middle colonies sent grain and corn, plus livestock and iron ore, while New England colonies sent fish, lumber, and whale oil for lighting lamps. They also built the ships to transport all of these goods. With England getting so rich on these imports, it didn't mind that the colonies were making a little money on the side. Plus, the English were kind of busy fighting wars, with France, with Spain, and even with themselves. So the colonies got used to doing their own thing and governing themselves. Each one elected a legislature, modeled on England's parliament. They debated current issues and passed laws about daily life. But their independence didn't last. Eventually, life calmed down in England, and King Charles II took over. He figured he could squeeze a lot more cash out of the colonies. So he passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws forcing the colonies to trade only with England, which Massachusetts basically ignored. In response, Charles canceled their charter, taking away their right to self-govern.
That's how it goes.
The next king, James II, cracked down even more. He took away the charters of all northern and most middle colonies and closed their legislatures. They were streamlined into a single colony, the Dominion of New England.
Enjoy Camp Barney.
Having just one colony was
Good to
much
see y'all
easier
too.
for the crown to control.
Be good.
Royal troops were brought in to enforce British law. And all churches were forced to hold
Thank you.
Church of England services. This was a major problem in northern colonies like Massachusetts. The Puritans who founded these places left England because they didn't like its church. Now the church was invading the society they'd set up. The colonists were furious and ready to revolt. Actually, this was almost a century before the Revolutionary War, but it did give the colonies a taste of standing up to the motherland. The old colonial governments were restored, and the crown backed down. After this, England went back to the policy of salutary neglect. It left the colonies alone, assuming they'd thrive without much supervision. And that's just what they did. Their economies boomed and populations soared. They were still loyal to England, but they got to run things pretty much on their own. England benefited too, saving the money they'd spent to keep the colonies in line. This situation worked pretty well for both sides, for about 75 years. Around then, France and England began fighting over lands out west, at which point England became very hands-on. It sent in an army to defend the colony's land rights in the French and Indian War. England would win that war, but only after spending an enormous amount of money. To pay for the victory, it seemed only fair to tax the colonies, and tax them hard. And so began the build-up to the American Revolution. Well, there you go. You're a free robot. I hope you've learned a valuable lesson about